This has got to go away. Yeah, we were here about 21 months, and it's been 21 months since we were here. So about the same length of time that Pastor Evan's been your pastor. And you can blame me if you want to that he's here. I think what you really should do is acknowledge that God wanted him here. Because the first time we talked, he was kind of going, well, I'm not sure that that's the right step for me at this time. And we did encourage him to pray about that. And I basically just looked at him and said, why not? And just why not? So the Lord has blessed. And the most exciting thing for me today, I enjoyed getting to hug some of your necks again. It's been a while, and I remembered a good chunk of the names. I'm working on it. But what's more exciting was seeing people that weren't here and new people that you've joined. You've started worshiping here since Carol and I were here almost 2 years ago, and that's so great to see. A couple of you have asked. I'm doing great. For those who didn't know, I was being treated for bladder cancer while I was here before, and treatments went well. Doctor told me last time I saw him a couple months ago, well, see you in a year, which that's good news for those of you who've done cancer treatments. When they say see you in a year, that's a good thing, and that's where we're at, so we're good. We're good. I'm going to do something a little different in the sermon this morning, and just kind of hang in there with me. The introduction's a little long, but just hang in there with me. I think you'll see where we're going. He was born September the 4th, 1918 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He entered radio very early in his life. As a teenager, he began broadcasting football games for the local high school. After brief stints at other stations and wartime service in the U.S. Army Air Corps, he ended his Army service in 1944 with a medical discharge. He relocated to Chicago, where he became well known as a radio broadcaster. He began adding brief vignettes in his radio broadcast of stories about people who were well known. And they became immensely popular. So ABC Radio premiered a standalone series May the 10th, 1976, 50 years ago. And he began broadcasting Monday through Friday this short 3 to 4 minute vignettes of stories. It was a very important program. At one point, 1,200 radio stations in the United States were broadcasting it. He did all the announcing, he did all the speaking, but his son worked with him and did the research for him, and then he would tell these stories. At one point, 24 million listeners tuned in. After his death, the radio station hired someone, a well-known broadcaster, to take his place. It flopped. It just didn't last at all. So after 33 years, the Paul Harvey's The Rest of the Story went off the air. Now, those of you who are young in the room, you never heard Paul Harvey. Those of us who were in the 70-plus range, we heard him a lot. The Rest of the Story was one of my favorite things on the radio. I listened to it 5 days a week. He took Sundays off, by the way. I listened to it every day because I really, really enjoyed it. I think I may have shared with you while I was here, I was a passionate reader growing up. I generally read a book a day, maybe at least a book a week. Now, before you get really excited about that, most of them were Westerns or sci-fi books. If it's Louis L'Amour, Max Brand, I read them all. My father had a collection of thousands of Westerns. I read them all. And I like stories. I like stories that are brief, that are succinct, that get to the point. I like stories. And today I want to tell you a story that you know. You've already heard the passage, and you know the story, and I think you realize, well, preacher, honestly, I know that one. There's not much you can teach me about that one. Really? Well, maybe we'll find out something new. Matthew 27, verses 45 through 46. Let's look at it again. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over the whole land. About 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you abandoned me? My former church in Corvallis is doing a series this summer on questions that Jesus asked. And they've asked me to come in August and preach 2 sermons answering 2 of those questions. This is one of them. Because of the way their series is geared, I'm not sure I can preach this exact sermon, but we may. What incredibly powerful, heart-rending words. My God. Remember, this is Dad. My Father. Why have you abandoned me? And all of us preacher types, when we come to this passage, that's what we focused on, is the abandonment of the Son by the Father. How heart-rending, how difficult that must have been for Jesus to be separated from the Father he had been with for all of eternity. And all of a sudden, there's this distance, this abandonment. So the first word that we hear out of this passage is this word abandoned. You know, I've read it so many times, and as a pastor, I've preached on this passage so many times. And one of the things that I know is that the words that Jesus speaks from the cross comes from a psalm. It comes from Psalm 22. Psalm 22 says this, my God, why have you abandoned me? That's Psalm 22, verse 1. And those are the words that Jesus speaks from the cross. Now, most scholars acknowledge that David is the author of Psalm 22. They're kind of undecided about when he wrote it. Did he write it when Saul was persecuting him and he was running from Saul and afraid that Saul was going to kill him? If you read all of Psalm 22, that sure seems to fit the passage, sure seems to fit the gist of what he's trying to say there. However, there's another occurrence in David's life when his son Absalom tries to kill him and take his throne. And some scholars say, well, maybe it's when Absalom was trying to usurp the throne. We don't know for sure, but when you read Psalm 22, it's this powerful, powerful story about pain and suffering and agony and the difficulty that David found himself in. And that's what Jesus quotes from the cross. Okay, preacher, big deal. He quotes that from the cross. Okay. Well, let me do something for you. Now, I'm just going to say a few words, and I want to see if you can follow what's going on. 7 years ago, our fathers founded on this continent a new nation. It's the Gettysburg Address. Abraham Lincoln. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people, well, I hope you know that one, the Declaration of Independence. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. Well, that's Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. I Have a Dream. Martin Luther King. That one's not the first words of the speech. It's right smack dab in the middle of his I Have a Dream speech in Washington, D.C. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. And I know those of you who've been around church for a while, you just kept on going, didn't you? When I do funerals, I did a memorial service yesterday in Corvallis for a godly man, but his wife asked me to come do that, and I did. But when I do a memorial service and I use Psalm 23, I always use King James. I mean, I don't use King James translation any other time. I do it for that. You know why? Because everybody in the congregation knows it in King James. They've memorized it in King James. People who don't go to church have memorized it in King James. And so if I start doing it in some other translation, they're going, that preacher doesn't know the passage. So anyway, I always do that one in King James. The first century Jew was a verbal person. They had an oral tradition, which means that they learned by hearing stories and repeating the stories. Now, we're pretty much a visual people. I mean, we have screens all over the place. We have screens, the words are up there, you're reading them, But we're a visual people. We want to see it. We have computer screens, TV screens that are always in front of our faces. And we're not so in the first century. They were a verbal, oral tradition. So they would tell stories and tell stories and tell stories. And one of the things that we've discovered about the first century Jewish people, the religious Jews of the first century, is that they would hear the first words of a passage. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And they would immediately think of the entire passage. All right, Jesus is on the cross. My God, why have you abandoned me? Now for us, it's those words. And that's the whole point. That's the thing that we focus on is those few words. But not a first century Jew. The first century Jew would go, oh, it's Psalm 22. And they would think of the entire passage. Like you think about the Declaration of Independence, or like you think about the Gettysburg Address, or you think about Psalm 23. They thought of the entire passage. And when Jesus uses these words on the cross, it's not just those two phrases. It's the entire chapter of Psalm that the Jewish mind goes to. Well, preacher, why is that important? Well, that's what the whole sermon's about. So hang in there, we're getting there. The second thing we see is that he is being mocked. On the day of the crucifixion, Jesus was mocked by various people. Roman soldiers, crowds on the street, religious leaders. He was even mocked by the thieves being crucified beside him. Okay, preacher, we know that part of the story. Here we go, Matthew 27, verses 27 to 29. Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the governor's residence and gathered the whole company around him. They stripped him and dressed him in a scarlet robe. They twisted together a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and placed a staff in his right hand. And they knelt down before him and mocked him. Hail, King of the Jews. They mocked him. These Roman soldiers mocked him. This happened before the cross. Pilate has him beaten with whips. The blood's pouring off his back. And they're mocking him. You're a king. And then they take him to the cross. Verses 39 through 43. Those who passed by were yelling insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests, with the scribes and elders, mocked him and said, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross, and we will believe him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he takes pleasure in him. For he said, I am the Son of God." The Son of God being mocked by those who came to save. Yeah, Pastor, we know the story. We've read the crucifixion story lots of times. Well, did you read Psalm 22? Psalm 22, verses 7 and 8. Listen. Everyone who sees me mocks me. They sneer and shake their heads. He relies on the Lord. Let him save him. Let the Lord rescue him, since he takes pleasure in him. Did you hear it? In Matthew, it's the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. If he takes pleasure in him. David, 1,000 years earlier, they mock me, since he takes pleasure in him. Those same words. When Jesus speaks from the cross And he quotes the very first phrases of Psalm 22, the religious leaders of the day, standing there watching him on the cross. They immediately thought of the entire psalm. That's how they thought. And they realized, oh my gosh, the parallels, the fulfillment. Exactly what King David wrote is happening right here on the cross. Exact same words, 1,000 years later. All right, third part of our outline is crucified. The earliest historical record of crucifixion dates to about 519 BC. King Darius I of Persia had 30,000 of his enemies crucified. It's the first record anywhere historically of a crucifixion. There is some record of other nations, other people groups, killing people by putting them on sharpened spears, sharpened posts. But the very first ever recorded instance of a crucifixion is 519 BC, King Darius. Well, preacher, okay, good history lesson, maybe. Why is that important? Psalm 22, verses 14 through 16. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are disjointed. My heart is like wax melting within me. My strength is dried up like baked clay. My tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You put me into the dust of death. For dogs have surrounded me. A gang of evildoers has closed in on me. They pierced my hands and feet. 500 years before any recorded crucifixion, David writes, they pierced my hands and feet. Now, theologians are a strange bunch. They really are. They argue about everything. And they want to parse every single word to make sure it works the way it should. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain Psalm 22. And in Psalm 22, the verse we just read, there is a flaw in the document, in the scroll. It's kind of scrubbed out, rubbed out. You can't make out the word for pierced. And so some have said, well, that word's not there. We don't know what the word there is, so maybe it doesn't say pierced, and maybe you can't talk about the predating idea of crucifixion. Well, we found another scroll, and it says pierced. Psalm 22, 500 years before the very first incidents that we can find in history of a crucifixion, David is writing, they pierced my hands and my feet. My body is disjointed. On the cross, what they did was they pulled the shoulders all but out of socket to nail the person to the cross. And on the cross, what the person did was because of the weight of their body, they couldn't breathe, so they had to pull themselves up, and shoulder dislocation was very common as they pulled themselves up again and again and again. And David wrote about it 1,000 years before it happened. Psalm 19, verses 28 to 30. After this, when Jesus knew that everything was now finished, that the scriptures might be fulfilled, he said, I'm thirsty. A jar full of sour wine was sitting there, so they fixed a sponge full of sour wine on a hyssop branch and held it up to his mouth. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished. Then bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. As you look at King David and his fleeing from Saul, as Saul's trying to kill him, you find David experiencing those things that are recorded in Psalm 22. He got thirsty. One of the most powerful stories of David is of his mighty men, hearing that he's thirsty. 3 of his mighty men go down and invade the camp of Saul and get water from the well and bring it to David. They risked their lives just because he said, I'm thirsty. By the way, David pours it out as an offering to God. On the cross, Jesus is calling them back to Psalm 22. Calling them back to something written 1,000 years ago, prophesying what's going to happen. And Jesus fulfills it on the cross. After drinking, he says, it is finished. Now, as a pastor, when I read those words, it's finished, you know what I go to? I go to the sacrifice is finished, folks. Jesus died on the cross for your sin. His blood poured out for yours because you deserve to die. Romans tells us the wages of sin is death. Jesus died in your place. He took your place. He took my place. His blood was poured out so that yours and mine doesn't have to be. Jesus says it's finished. The sacrifice is finished. But that's not all that's finished. See, that's the story we know. That's the story we tell. The story we sometimes miss is that it is finished means the prophecies are fulfilled. And that also is finished. There's one more seemingly random part of the crucifixion I want to talk about. It's a part that most people look at and just kind of go, why in the world is it there? I mean, come on. Why are they even talking about it? Anybody figured out what it is yet? Hang on. Here we go. Matthew 27:35. After crucifying him, they divided his clothes by casting lots. Isn't that the weirdest verse? The strangest verse. Here's the crucifixion. Jesus is dying on the cross, and Matthew says, oh, by the way, the soldiers at the foot of the cross, they were casting lots to see who got his clothes. Why is that included? Why is that there? It's insignificant. Who cares? I mean, you know what we would do? Bloody clothes? We're throwing them away. The soldiers were casting lots because, hey, it's clothes. They take them home, hand them to the wife, say, hun, wash these out. Kids are going to wear them. Why is it included? Well, glad you asked. Psalm 22:18. They divided my garments among them, and they cast lots for my clothing. 1,000 years before the cross. 1,000 years before the cross. Listen, Jesus is deliberately, intentionally, willfully fulfilling prophecy. He knew he needed to go to the cross. He knew he needed to be executed on the cross. Jesus is intentionally, willfully, deliberately fulfilling prophecy. Guess what? This is part of the prophecy he cannot deliberately, willfully, intentionally fulfill. He has nothing to do with this part. He's on the cross. The soldiers at his feet are fulfilling prophecy, not having a clue they did it. These are Roman soldiers. They were not Jewish scholars. They didn't know the Old Testament. But the chief priests, the scribes, the elders, and for that part, honestly, most of the general folks. Psalm 22 was well known. They knew exactly what was happening. He was fulfilling prophecy. And Jesus couldn't even orchestrate it. Why did Matthew include it? Why is it in the text of the New Testament? Because Matthew understood. Matthew knew about Psalm 22. Matthew knew about the fulfillment of prophecy. Matthew understood when Jesus said it's finished, it wasn't just the sacrifice was finished, the prophecy was finished. It was fulfilled by what Jesus did on the cross. That random act of those soldiers gambling for the clothes wasn't random at all. It was God's announcement, I've fulfilled my promises to you. Now, if you leave the story there, you miss the best part. The thing about Paul Harvey's The Rest of the Story was you had to wait till the end. You listened for 3 minutes and, you had to get off the radio. You missed the good part. You wanted to listen to the last few minutes. Here we go. The last part of our outline is restored. Psalm 22 begins as this incredibly sorrowful and depressing psalm. If you read the first few verses, you're just getting more and more depressed. It's kind of like, okay, God, do I have to read this psalm? Well, yeah. And you got to get to the end, because that's when it gets exciting. Psalm 22, verses 27 through 28. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord. All the families of the nations will bow down before you, for kingship belongs to the Lord, for he rules the nations. David, this guy who'd been anointed king, he'd been anointed king. You're going to be the king. Where is he? He's hiding in a cave from the current king who wants to kill him. God, why am I here? You promised me that I was going to be king. You had your prophet anoint me with oil in front of the family. My brothers were all told I'm going to be king, and I'm cowering in a tunnel in a cave. Yeah, because God keeps his promises, but sometimes to get to the promise, you have to go past the cross. You have to go through the cave. You have to go through the difficulties. I told you I did a memorial service yesterday. This isn't in the sermon. This is free. It's just added. Larry Rickliff was his name. Larry was 78. Larry had MS. He was a Marine. He was a pilot. He was a hunter, a hiker, an outdoorsman. He was a cowboy. Loved to ride, and he ranched in, worked on ranches in Montana. He was a cowboy. But MS took all of that from him. Took all of it from him. By the time I met him a few years ago, 10, 15 years ago, Larry was in a wheelchair all the time. Every day. All day. In a wheelchair. God, why? God, why did I have to go through that? His wife read a letter at the service yesterday. A letter from a prisoner that probably will never get out of prison. His crimes were horrendous. He's not getting out of prison. Larry wrote to prisoners for 34 years, encouraging them, sharing Jesus with them for 34 years. It's old school evangelism. He wrote letters to prisoners. She read the letter about how Larry led him to Christ, how Larry encouraged him, even though he's probably never getting out of prison, encouraged him to become a better man, a better person, become a believer, to follow Jesus. Would Larry ever have done that if he wasn't confined to the wheelchair? I don't know. You don't know either. But what I know is that God can take us through the storms and the difficulties of life. And on the other side, there's victory. And Larry found victory. So, preacher, he died. Yeah, he did. And he's with Jesus today. And that's better than. That's pretty good. David, the king to be, found himself in despair. But he had the confidence to write the last verses of Psalm 22. He's going to be king. Jesus on the cross understands that he's got to go through the cross for the crown. John 12:32. As for me, these are Jesus' words, if I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself. He told this to his disciples. He told them, and they didn't get it. They did not understand he meant a cross. Lifted up, he thought, well, he's going to be high and lifted up like important people. Yeah, high and lifted up on a cross. That's what it was. There's something incredibly comforting about the fact that Jesus quoted a psalm that begins with heartbreak, because honestly, most of us have experienced a little bit of heartbreak along the way. Difficulty, loss, failure. We messed up. Our life was a mess. And yet Jesus promises victory. And he starts with that psalm. Jesus himself, carrying the weight of sin and suffering on the cross, prays words soaked in anguish, not because he lacked faith, but because he had faith. David writes the words of Psalm 22, not because he lacks faith, but because he has faith. He pours out his heart. Here's where I'm at. This is terrible. This is bad. This is, oh my gosh, God, what's going on here? But he ends it with a statement of faith. Jesus on the cross ends with a statement of faith. It's finished. It's finished. I want you to imagine something with me. I want you to imagine you're the religious leader standing around the cross. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they all inform us that the religious leaders that were there, I think they stood at a distance and kind of watched, but they listened, they heard, they understood exactly what Jesus was doing. He was referencing Psalm 22. And they were listening, thinking through Psalm 22, going, oh my gosh, everything in Psalm 22 is being fulfilled right there. It's being fulfilled right there. I want you to imagine being the religious leaders, the scribes, the elders, the ones who knew the Old Testament. They were watching it being fulfilled in front of their eyes and still rejecting Jesus. Still rejecting Jesus. Oh, it'd be like somebody standing. Did you have a thunderstorm here the other day? Thunder and lightning, rain. It'd be like somebody standing outside in the middle of that rainstorm, looking up at the sky and saying, I see no evidence of rain. Really? Jesus is on the cross, fulfilling prophecy, fulfilling the Old Testament. Preacher, we're New Testament Christians. Well, good. You ought to be New Testament Christians. But while you're at it, why don't you read the Old Testament and find out that the New Testament fulfills the Old Testament? It's kind of important. It's really important. When Jesus says it is finished on the cross, it's not just that the sacrifice is finished. The prophecy's finished. The prophecies from 1,000 years ago, they're finished. They're finished. And he gives up his spirit and dies. But not until he made sure we got the words. It's finished. It's finished. Listen, you need to know your whole Bible. There's a whole lot more I could add here. I thought about it. If you go back to the Exodus story where God speaks to Moses and tells him, take a lamb and tell the folks this is what you're supposed to do, this is what you're supposed to do. If you'll take the Exodus story and then read the last week of Jesus' life and compare the two accounts, you're just going to go, whoa, how did I miss that for so many years? The lamb was selected. The lamb was selected. The lamb was chosen, a perfect lamb without any blemish. The lamb with, there's a whole bunch there. They took a hyssop branch and they poured the blood around the doorpost. They took a hyssop branch and gave Jesus a drink of water on the cross. It's amazing. Jesus fulfilled so many prophecies, and if you don't know the Old Testament, you don't know how he fulfilled them in the New Testament. Let me encourage you to know it all. Listen, Jesus stayed on the cross, even though the religious leaders were rejecting him. He stayed there for the mockers. He stayed there for the doubters. He stayed there for the disciples who ran. He stayed there for Peter, who denied him, for the soldiers gambling about his clothes. He stayed there for people like you and for me. Because he was fulfilling prophecy, he was paying our debt, and he was expressing the Father's love for us. Jesus is still drawing people to him. Maybe today he's drawing you. For the very first time, you realize, I need forgiveness. I need a Savior. I need somebody to forgive my sin, to allow me to become a follower of Christ. You may not understand it all. That's fine. I've been a Christian now for, think about it, 65 years. I'm still learning. I've been studying the Bible seriously for a long time, and I'm still learning. You don't have to know it all. What you do have to do is acknowledge that Jesus is Savior and Lord, and ask him to forgive your sin and become the boss, the Lord, the guide of your life, and worship him. And if God's calling you today, if Jesus is drawing you today, oh, please don't go away without talking to Pastor Evan, without talking to me. Let us talk to you about Jesus, because we want you to know the grace, the amazing grace that we found in a Jesus who died on the cross for your sin and mine, because he loves us and he fulfilled all of those prophecies. And now maybe you know the rest of the story. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for loving us. Thank you so much for offering us your grace, your forgiveness. Lord, thank you for Jesus. Thank you for his willingness to die for my sin, for the sin of everyone in this room. Lord, help us to understand. Help us to truly see what happened on the cross. Jesus died to fulfill prophecy. Jesus died to demonstrate the Father's love. Jesus died so that I can know forgiveness and grace. And Lord, I just pray that there's anyone in this room who's never accepted Jesus as Lord and Savior, that today's the day. Today's the day they say, yes, Lord, I want